Going back to the SQL Server here, what does the Transact SQL include is the database types will vary between the relational database to relational database, whether when we compare the SQL Server to the Oracle or when we compare the SQL Server to MySQL, the database types will vary. The table constraints might vary, stored procedures might vary, triggers might vary, functions might vary, temporary tables might vary. So the T-SQL, which is the Transact SQL developed by Microsoft and Sybase, will include all those things like data types, table constraints, stored procedures, triggers, functions, and in functions we'll have two types of functions, which is system-defined functions and user-defined functions. That means you can even create some functions on our own, and there are already some pre-existing functions which will be used to do some aggregations, do some math, uh, to perform some string operations to like concat or trim, do some logical operations. So there are various system defined functions, and you can even create functions on your own. And the next one is temporary tables, and some other concepts in T-SQL is CTE, common table expressions, subqueries, merge query, cursors, magical tables, and transaction management. So these are the main entities in the Transact SQL. Right now, we'll not go into deep into this. We'll see the basic creation. When it comes to the practical things, we will just see the basic commands and the DDL, also if time permits on DML as well. Mm, That is all about on a high level on the introduction of Transact SQL. Finishing the Transact SQL, will be not left with much more of the things. The designing. So when it comes to the database, there will be two main zoners. One is designing the database, and the other one is developing the database. Okay, so having the good knowledge of SQL commands and T-SQL concepts, you'll be, and we need to know little things on the RDBMs as well, and little other things which include the database normalization things. When it comes to the designing part, when you design the tables, when you design the relationships, so we need to know little other things like what are the different integrity that can be provided, which is again like coming under the concepts of relational database management system and the database normalization things that we need to perform, which is a standard uh, that compromises the designing and development part. Other than these, I was not so expertise on the administration side, but I do know like the basic things like how can we create multiple logins, how can we create users, how can we provide and various permissions for the particular user, also providing a complete access to the database or providing specific access to the tables or particular database objects to execute, providing different permissions, all those things. I do know little things on that, but I haven't got a chance to work on that super sophisticatedly. So the next part is database SQL Server administration part, which where we can have the things like creation of logins and users, and granting and revoking the permissions, and scheduling and monitoring the SQL Server agent jobs. So to do something on an automated daily on a particular schedule, we do have a SQL Server agent where we can create some SQL jobs, which can execute a batch of SQL statements or execute a store procedure on a given schedule. And there will be a log for that job. So based on the schedule, the job will be triggered automatically, uh, and it will run. And when we will see whether we can also see whether the job is ran successfully or it's a failure, and there will be a generic text, another text why it got failed as well. All those monitoring things also we can see going forward. Yes, we are here. We will see some practical things we can play around. So, firstly, to understand, like to execute something on a database, and we need to create a session uh, by authenticating the session, uh, and then only we can execute any SQL statements. So, right now in this SSMS IDE, you can see I have opened a new query window which represent a session. So right now, as we on the left in the Object Explorer, we do have connected to a database instance, and when we don't open this, you can see there is a selection on the server, and when we click on New Query, based on this selection, it will use this connection, and it will open that session. For example, right now I do have one database instance which is localhost. I will also show you a different instance here. Oops. So if you see now, the selection is on a second server, which is remote actually. This is not a local instance. That is the reason you can see a IP address followed by port number. So if I click on new query now, you can see that this query is pointed to a particular server, where we can see that 122 point, which is the IP followed by the port number. And right now, this session is pointing to the master database. If you don't have the selection on any particular database, it will by default it will point to the master database or a default database. While creating the logins, you can even set what would be the default database, and based on that default database configuration, this window will open with the default database. Okay, I'm just disconnecting to the server. Now you can see, like if you want to AdventureWorks is a sample database that is provided by Microsoft itself. Um Once you install the database server, you can download this sample from online, and you can restore the database and play around. Like it will have some default tables and default schemas, all the default database things, including the data. So if you want to play around, you can use this AdventureWorks database uh, as a practice database. Right now, we will see how can we create a database. As you mentioned, we do use DDL command, but because it is related to data definition. So that is the reason we are using create command, which comes on the DDL. Create database. And SQL Server is not case sensitive, but I habituated myself to follow the standard naming conventions. By default, if you generate any script, there will be a default standard that is provided by Microsoft SQL server. So I was a little bit habituated with the syntax. So though you write it in the lower case, like create caps lock is on, create database SQL practice. Okay, so it got executed. Though I change the case of it, so though I change the case of it, create, I'll use some characters as capital for the keywords. It doesn't matter. It is not at all a case sensitive language in SQL Server. Some relational databases might be case sensitive, so we need to be a little bit conscious there. But by default, SQL Server is not at all case sensitive. So whatever the keywords case is, it doesn't bother about that. Right now we have created a database. Now, once the database has been created, we can switch to that particular database in two ways. One, using the command use followed by database name SQL practice. See, we can on the left on this bar, you can see which database